This day and time. What happened today, years ago.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're doing something a little different. We're focusing in on just one date, June 29th, and we're going to see how three, seemingly unconnected historical events from totally different centuries actually give us some pretty profound insights. Insights into justice, art, and even the brink of war. We'll be looking at the 1972 Supreme Court decision, Furman v. Georgia, on capital punishment. Then jumping back to the dramatic fire at Shakespeare's Globe Theatre in 1613.
Yeah, quite a story there.
And finally, a really critical turning point in the July crisis of 1914, the one that, tipped the world into World War I. So our mission here is to really unpack these moments, pull out the key facts, the surprising bits, and figure out what they might actually mean for us today. Okay, ready to dive in?
Let's do it.
All right, let's kick off our deep dive on June 29th, 1972. This date marked a huge shift, almost like a legal earthquake, right?
Yeah.
The Supreme Court's verdict in Furman v. Georgia temporarily stopped capital punishment. What was going on there?
Well, what's fascinating is the background leading up to it. You had growing opposition to the death penalty after the 1960s. Public opinion was shifting. And very importantly, the NAACP was running a really strategic legal campaign. Their main argument wasn't necessarily, is the death penalty wrong, but more, how it was being applied. They argued it was so arbitrary that it violated the Eighth Amendment, the part about cruel and unusual punishment.
In William Henry Furman's case, that really put a spotlight on the arbitrary aspect, didn't it? Tell us about him.
Yeah, Furman's story is pretty stark. He was a poor black man, and he had an intellectual disability. He was convicted of murder. What happened was his gun went off accidentally while he was trying to rob a house, killing the homeowner.
Wow.
And his trial. It lasted just one day, and he got the death sentence.
Unbelievable.
It was just a clear example of that sort of arbitrary and unusual application the NAACP was challenging. His case became the test case, really.
So, June 29th, the verdict comes down. What did the court actually rule?
So, the court ruled 5-4 that the way the death penalty was being applied was unconstitutional, at least in those specific circumstances before them. But here's where it gets really interesting and complicated. There wasn't one single majority opinion. It was very fragmented. You had some justices who just objected to the arbitrary way it was used. But then you had two justices who believed the death penalty was fundamentally immoral, always, full stop.
And the dissenters.
Right, and then 4 justices dissented. They basically argued, look, this is something for state legislatures to decide, not the courts.
Okay, so a 5-4 split, but with all these different reasons floating around, that sounds messy.
It was messy.
What were the immediate consequences and, the longer-term impact?
Well, immediately, about 700 death sentences right across the country were canceled, just like that.
Wow, 700.
Yeah. And then states scrambled. They rushed to rewrite their death penalty laws, trying to make them seem, more legalized, more structured, less arbitrary. But here's the great irony, and maybe the biggest takeaway. This ruling, which was meant to restrict capital punishment, it actually ended up helping to sort of fortify the system in the long run. It made states create these detailed procedures.
So it made it harder to challenge later.
Exactly. By forcing states to codify everything, it inadvertently legitimized the process more, making future broad challenges much more difficult. It just shows how legal reforms can sometimes have these really unexpected, counterintuitive results. It can reshape systems in ways nobody predicted.
That is a powerful irony. A reform aimed at curbing something actually ends up strengthening its foundations. It's a reminder, isn't it, that systems, whether legal or otherwise, can be disrupted in really unforeseen ways. And that echoes, strangely enough, centuries earlier on this exact same date, June 29th, with the very dramatic burning of Shakespeare's Globe Theatre.
Yes, absolutely. We jump way back now from the serious setting of the Supreme Court to June 29th, 1613, a fiery spectacle that destroyed one of the most iconic theaters ever. And you have to remember, the Globe wasn't just like a building, it was the absolute creative heart of English theater's golden age.
Built by Shakespeare himself and his acting troupe, right?
Exactly. In 1599, it was actually a groundbreaking model for artists owning their own creative business, a real hub of art and commerce.
Okay, so June 29th, 1613, they're putting on a performance of Henry VIII, and I understand a stage prop caused the disaster.
That's right. They used a small cannon for sound effects for a theatrical flourish, and on this day it misfired somehow and set the thatched roof on fire.
Oh, thatch. Yeah, that would go up fast.
Extremely fast. The whole theater was apparently consumed by flames in about an hour.
An hour, the whole thing.
The whole thing. What's incredible, though, is that apparently nobody died. Contemporary letters and even some satirical poems written afterwards mention maybe a few minor injuries, someone's breeches catching fire but being put out with beer.
Huh. You can't make this stuff up.
Right, but essentially, no major casualties. Just this incredibly rapid, dramatic destruction.
But that wasn't the end of the globe, was it? It famously came back.
Not at all. That's the other remarkable part. They rebuilt it within a year.
A year? That's fast.
Incredibly fast. And this time, crucially, they used fireproof tiles for the roof, not thatch.
Learned their lesson there.
Could say that. But the speed of rebuilding, it really tells you something about the financial strength and just the organizational power of the theater industry back then. It was a serious business. There's another layer here, too, which is kind of fascinating. This fire happened right around the time Shakespeare was retiring.
Oh, interesting timing.
Yeah, it creates this sort of haunting metaphor, doesn't it? The end of his career, the theater burning down, it even makes you think of Prospero's lines in The Tempest.
The great globe itself shall dissolve.
Exactly that line. It just powerfully shows how art, business, maybe even fate seem to weave together, but it also shows incredible resilience, you know? The ability to rebuild, for creativity to endure, even after disaster.
What a fantastic story of resilience. Art and commerce literally rising from the ashes. And yet, sticking with June 29th, we pivot again, this time to 1914. And here we see another kind of system, political, military, proving maybe surprisingly fragile, leading to just catastrophic results. We're talking about the July crisis. The Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated the day before, on June 28th. So what was it about June 29th that made it such a critical point in that slide towards World War I?
Oh, you absolutely need the context. Europe at that time was just this incredibly complex tangle of defensive alliances. You had nationalism surging everywhere, a huge arms race underway. And the Balkans, where the assassination happened, were famously called the powder keg of Europe. Austria-Hungary and Russia had directly competing interests there. So the assassination on the 28th, that lit the fuse. But it was the decisions made immediately after that really caused the explosion.
Okay, so the Archduke is dead on the 28th. What specifically happened on the 29th that pushed things forward?
The key thing on June 29th was really about the internal discussions and decisions within the Austro-Hungarian government. Essentially, the factions arguing for a strong military response against Serbia started to gain the upper hand.
The Hawks took charge.
Pretty much. While the final ultimatum and declaration of war were still weeks away, it was around the 29th that the mindset shifted decisively. They began to see the assassination less as just a crime to be investigated, and more as the perfect excuse, the pretext they'd almost been waiting for, to crush Serbia and reassert their own power in the region.
So the intent to use this as a justification for war really solidified then?
Yes, that momentum built critically on the 29th. It set the trajectory for everything that followed in July.
And that decision, that intent, was then massively reinforced just a few days later by Germany's famous blank check. Right.
Absolutely pivotal, yes. On July 5th, Germany's Kaiser and Chancellor basically told Austria-Hungary, whatever you decide to do about Serbia, we've got your back, unconditionally.
Which sounds supportive, but potentially dangerous.
Hugely dangerous. Germany, critically, seemed to believe that any conflict could be kept local, that Russia wouldn't, or perhaps couldn't, step in to protect Serbia in a wider war.
A massive miscalculation in hindsight.
A catastrophic miscalculation. It emboldened Austria-Hungary to be aggressive, but it also tied Germany's own fate to whatever Vienna did. It drastically reduced the chances for diplomacy and made a much larger war almost inevitable.
And it certainly didn't stay localized, which leads to that striking description often used for this period, nations acting like sleepwalkers. What does that really capture about the start of the war?
Yeah, the sleepwalkers analogy, used by historian Christopher Clark and others, is powerful. It suggests that the leaders and nations involved were making these fateful decisions within a really dangerous international system, a system they had helped create, but without fully grasping the terrible consequences of their actions.
So it wasn't necessarily one country being purely evil or aggressive.
It's more complex than that. The argument is that the war wasn't really the result of a single villain or some master plan for conquest. It was more a product of the system itself breaking down. Systemic failures, rigid alliances that left no room to maneuver, nationalism blinding people, miscalculations.
Wow.
It's a sobering lesson, isn't it? How these huge political and military machines can just spiral out of control, driven by their own flawed logic, not necessarily by pure malice, but by error, inflexibility, and a real failure of foresight.
What a journey through just one date, June 29th. It's incredible, really. We've touched on the search for justice, the resilience of art, and the terrifying ways nations can just stumble into catastrophic conflict.
Exactly. You look at Furman v. Georgia in '72, and you see how complex justice is, how attempts at reform can backfire in unexpected ways. Then the Globe Fire in 1613, it shows that deep connection between art, business, maybe even destiny, but also that amazing ability to rebuild, to persist.
Yeah.
And then 1914, the July crisis, it's a stark reminder of how systems, political and military systems, can just overwhelm the people within them.
Yeah.
Leading to disaster through error and systemic flaws, not just bad intentions.
3 very different events, 3 very different eras, all linked by this one date. So as we wrap up this deep dive, maybe something for you to consider is this. These 3 moments, the court ruling, the theater fire, the diplomatic crisis spanning centuries, different fields entirely, yet all converging on June 29th. They all seem to highlight this ongoing human struggle, don't they? Our struggle to create perfect systems, whether it's in law or art or how nations interact. And they show how often, despite our best plans, our grand designs, something unexpected happens. An accident, an unforeseen consequence, maybe just a flaw deep within the system itself.
Right.
And suddenly, reality is completely reshaped.
Yeah.
What could these seemingly random connections on a single date tell us about deeper patterns? About history, about human behavior, about those unpredictable ripple effects of our actions? Something to definitely mull over until our next deep dive.
Thanks for watching. Like, subscribe, and ring that bell for more history daily.